Hi, my name is Brendan Scott, and I'm the historian in residence for Cavan County Council during the decade of Centenaries programme. And tonight's talk is a one-off lecture to mark the centenary of the attack on Travers Blackley. And there will be at least one other one-off centenary commemoration talk during the summer as well. But I will be delivering as well another series of short webisodes like I did last year. They'll be happening in early summer, I hope. And there's also a really exciting range of lectures which have been organised, which will be delivered at the end of this year as well. But the topic for this evening's talk is the attack on Travers Blackley on the 8th of April 1922, just one day shy of 100 years ago when this lecture goes out. And around midnight on Saturday, the 8th of April 1922, at Drumbar House outside Cavan town, Travers Robert Blackley, the Farnham's estate agent, aged 55, and his son and namesake, aged 23, were awoken by the noise of a group of men approaching their house. Blackley, aided by the faint moonlight that night, later estimated that 20 men approached the house by the front drive. Blackley and his son were both armed with revolvers and waited inside the house for the men making their approach. The intruders burst onto the porch of the house, firing on Blackley and the son. And Blackley's son had served in World War I, so he had military experience. Bombs were also allegedly thrown. And in the skirmish, according to Blackley in his later account of that night, 3 of the attackers were shot and killed by Blackley and the son. They themselves survived the experience unscathed, physically anyway. And another 3 men who attacked them were wounded. Blackley later claimed in an affidavit to have seen the bodies of the 3 men who were dead being dragged down the back avenue by the remaining assailants. Now, traumatic as this experience undoubtedly was for Blackley and his family, his fortunes took a further downturn after this, and this Dublin man who had lived and worked for much of his life at Cavan was forced, following this incident, to leave the county and Ireland entirely, and instead live the rest of his life in England. So this talk will tell the story of Travers R. Blackley and the Farnham estate in Cavan during the revolutionary period. Now, this is Blackley here, Travers Blackley, and he was born on the 6th of January 1867 in Dublin, the eldest child of Travers Robert Blackley Sr., who was a merchant, and Honorine Blackley, née Gibson, of 41 Upper Fitzwilliam Street, and they had married in February the previous year. Travers was baptised 3 days later into the Church of Ireland in St. Stephen's Parish, Dublin, and had at least 7 more siblings who were born over the following years. Blackley attended Charterhouse School in England and then went on to Exeter College at Oxford University, where he excelled at rugby, captaining the college team for a number of seasons. From 1890, Blackley had been under agent for C.K. Cordner, the land agent on the Masserine estate in County Antrim, and in 1896 had also begun to work on the Masserine estate himself in a more senior capacity. Incidentally, that guy C.K. Cordner is remembered today as a very good cricketer. In December 1896, now aged 30 years old, Blackley applied for the post of estate agent on the Farnham estate in County Cavan. The Maxwell family, by whom Blackley was going to be employed at Farnham, they had arrived at Farnham, which is not far outside Cavan town, in the mid-17th century, and from that point on began to buy up and inherit further estates and properties throughout Cavan and further afield, until they were the wealthiest and most important landowners in the county. By the late 19th century, the estate amounted to 29,000 statute acres with an annual income of £13,100 in 1897. The head of the family was first ennobled in 1756, a guy called John Maxwell, who became the first Baron Farnham, and the following 2 Barons Farnham also became Earls of Farnham as well. The family were also politically active, with a number of them sitting as MPs and representative peers in both houses. Now, this man here, James Pierce Maxwell, who's the 9th Lord Farnham, when he succeeded to the title in 1884, he had very little interest in the day-to-day running of Farnham estate. He lived in England, and during his time, the estate was run by Archibald Godley, and the house was closed up, essentially. But upon James's death in 1896, his nephew, Somerset Henry Maxwell, who is now the 10th Lord Farnham, inherited both the title and the estate. And this is Somerset here. Somerset and his family moved into Farnham, having previously lived at Arley on the shores of Loch Sheelan, and the local economy felt the benefit of a family ensconced in Farnham once again. Dissatisfied with the performance of Archibald Godley as James's land agent, as his predecessor's land agent, Somerset began to search for a new man who could run the Farnham estate for him. And such a man was soon to arrive in the shape of Travers Blackley, who, until his departure in 1922, was the most important and visible figure in the management of the Farnham estate, aside from Lord Farnham himself. In his letter of application to Lord Farnham on the 12th of December 1896, Blackley affirmed his happiness to live at Farnham and to refrain from taking any other work. One of the problems with Archibald Godley was that he didn't live near the estate, he lived a journey away. And he noted his success in collecting over £25,000 per annum for his current employer, Cordner, whom Blackley wrote would be happy to provide a reference for him. Initially, Blackley's application was rebuffed, as in a letter dated the 17th of December 1896, he wrote to Farnham to say that it is a disappointment to know what might have been if I had known in time, i.e. if he had known about the job vacancy. But he still asked whether he might introduce himself to Farnham at the next meeting of the Grand Orange Lodge. They were both members of the Orange Order. Now, we don't know when they met, but something happened to change Farnham's mind, and he hired Blackley for the post of Farnham estate agent. Indeed, Jonathan Cherry, who's done a lot of work on the Farnham estate, has speculated that Blackley's involvement in the Orange Order was a major factor in his appointment as Farnham estate agent. In a letter that Blackley wrote to Farnham on the 28th of December 1896, on headed paper, it was headed Masserine Office, Estate Office on it, so he was still up at Masserine. Blackley wrote in this letter on the 28th of December that I can't express all I feel for your kindness in appointing me your agent, and can assure you that I will do everything in my power to prove myself worthy of the confidence you are putting in me. So somewhere before Christmas and after Christmas, Farnham changed his mind and decided to appoint Blackley as the agent. This is the house that Blackley would have seen when he began work there. This is Farnham House in the early 20th century. Blackley began his employment on the Farnham estate in early 1897, and an agreement between the agent and owner was signed on the 1st of February that year. And that agreement can be seen in the wonderful archive of Farnham material that the County Library has in Cavan town. It's really well worth having a look at it there. But in this agreement, Blackley agreed to a salary of £500 per annum and the use of Drumbar House free of charge, where he'd be living. In return, Blackley was to collect the rents, supervise the estate, and ensure the smooth day-to-day running and administration of the estate through the keeping of suitable accounts and records. Blackley was also required to pay a security of £7,000, which would be effective during Blackley's appointment and tenure as agent. Blackley entered his employment with Farnham with great enthusiasm, and in his first year there, the rent arrears for Cavan town were halved, and records were now being kept in what was described as a meticulous fashion. Every facet of the estate and its administration was part of Blackley's brief, from game, like game shooting, although there was also a gamekeeper, to the woodlands, as well as the farms, the homesteads, the rents. He also took an interest in the improvement of the big house itself, including the installation of running water there and a major remodelling of the house itself, it having been neglected during James Pearce's tenure as 9th Lord Farnham from 1884 to 96. Now, as stipulated in his employment contract, Blackley took up residence at Drumbar House, a two-storey house which was built around 1800 and which included entrance gates and a gate lodge. This very comfortable residence, which was renovated in 1898, probably to coincide with Blackley's upcoming nuptials, which we'll be coming to shortly, had recently been occupied by a family called Somerville, and also had the advantage of its situation close to the Farnham estate outside Cavan town. It also had the disadvantage, as Blackley would later discover, of being quite secluded, thus exposed and open to those who may have held a grudge against Blackley. Now, Blackley seems to have begun his time at Farnham wishing to really make his mark there, with the kind of cost-cutting and money-saving decisions which would have been popular with Farnham, but which would not have endeared himself to the tenants or those who lived locally. He wrote to Farnham every day. There's a massive amount of letters from Blackley to Farnham in the archives in the National Library in Dublin. But he writes to Farnham practically every day, and there's lots of mentions of disputes with tenants, which he hoped to settle out of court, about the eviction of tenants, the dismissal of staff for taking bribes and for being drunk. He also writes about his suspicions that letters were being opened at Cavan Post Office. He writes about his altercation with two young men called Nesbitt, who ignored Blackley's orders not to cut down trees, and who displayed what Blackley remarked on as a good deal of impudence in the exchange. He also accused a man called Pat Brady of telling Farnham what he calls a string of lies. He fired an employee called Bloomer, and he prevented the trespass of animals and people through the woods of Dunawheel and Port Longfield near Killashandra. And he reckoned that over there, the Farnham's caretakers of those woods, and what Blackley says is they do far more harm than anyone else. Nor had Blackley anything positive to say about a forester named McKendrick, who had applied for a post on the Farnham estate. Blackley discovered that he'd been dismissed from a previous post for idleness and recommended the Farnham not hire him. Written by Blackley on a letter to Farnham, requesting that he persuade Blackley to give a tenant more time to pay his rent. There's a note which read, "Rogers has broken every promise. I would not make one to him." So this guy called writes a letter to Farnham saying, "Please give me more time on my rent." Blackley obviously gets a hold of this letter and writes on the letter, "Don't give him anything, because he will only let you down." His standing, such as it was, Blackley's standing, would also have fallen if he had made public such pronouncements as he made in a letter about hiring someone to manage markets in Cavan Town, writing shortly after he took the post of estate agent that it will be necessary to appoint a very honest man for the post, and I doubt whether this commodity is to be obtained about Cavan. So he's writing in a letter to Farnham saying, we need someone to manage the markets of Cavan, an honest man. But where would you find an honest man in Cavan? That's what he's saying. He's only been in Cavan a few months at this point when he's saying these things. So if that ever got public, that wouldn't have gone down terribly well. Referring to the drunkenness of an employee, Blackley wrote, "What fools they are, it is most annoying." A Farnham person who seems to have been fired by Blackley for drunkenness wrote a letter directly to Farnham to plead his case, stating that I have a wife and 7 children, all small, and that I told Mr. Blackley that I would take the pledge against drink if it was drink that done it, i.e. if that was what had gotten him fired. Blackley's disinclination to hire locals for certain positions on the estate and the changes he made to the grazing rights of certain tenants may also have damaged his reputation locally. But his ruthless actions upon entering office do indicate that Blackley felt that this was the best way of gaining the trust and high opinion of his employer. So Farnham was probably quite happy for these things to happen, and certainly probably happy for somebody else to be doing it rather than him. And certainly Blackley was meticulous in his account taking, and his salary, which was the highest paid to any employee on the estate, indicated his worth to Farnham. Now, the role didn't always have to be negative in nature, and just prior to Blackley assuming his post as estate agent, Somerset Henry Maxwell, the new 10th Lord Farnham, had written of the importance of the estate agent's involvement in county business and in the everyday business of County Cavan. This is the problem that Somerset Maxwell had had with the previous land agent, Archibald Godley, that he wasn't in Cavan and he had a low profile and did nothing to kind of promote the Farnham name and interest in the county. Farnham went on to advocate for the agent to live locally, and by doing so, what he said was, if the agent is living locally, he will form what Farnham called a connecting link between me and the people. As I say, something that had been missing under the stewardship of Archibald Godley. The following reminiscence from Patrick McKiernan in a wonderful book written by P.J. Dunn and Eugene Riley on the Farnham School. This guy, Patrick McKiernan, began working on the Farnham estate in 1916, aged 13 years old. And this little anecdote gives us an idea of the public role, the public nature, I suppose, of Blackley's role on the estate. Every Christmas, each employee on the Farnham estate was gifted with a parcel of clothes worth 10 shillings for the men and 5 shillings for the women. And McKiernan recounted that on Christmas Eve, all the parcels were laid out on a long bench. Lord and Lady Farnham, their family, and Mr. Blackley, the land agent, used to stand behind this bench. After each worker was presented with his parcel, everyone moved up to the foot of the steps of the big house upon which the Farnham family stood. All the assembled workers then gave a collective 3 cheers for the Farnham family. And is likely the person who led those cheers was probably Blackley himself. Now, Somerset, Maxwell, the 10th Lord Farnham, who had hired Blackley, he, as I say, he expected Blackley to play a public role on the estate, and Blackley organised, for example, a large bonfire to be built on the domain to celebrate Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897. He also organised orange walks and marches and different things as well. Now, in the initial years of his employment at Farnham, Travers was not only finding his way professionally in Cavan, but he was also making important decisions regarding his personal life. And he married a lady called Ethel Julia Cumming on the 2nd of June, 1898. Now, Ethel was from Crover, and she out at Ballymacue, the Church of Ireland parish of Ballymacue, and the marriage most likely took place at St. Paul's Church in Ballymacue. Now, various branches of the Maxwell family had residences out there, like at Arley, Fortland, out around Lough Sheelin, and Somerset Henry had lived at Arley before he became Lord Farnham. And it's likely that Blackley would have known the area quite well as a result of that. Ethel's father, Edward William Cumming, was a colonel in the British Army, and by making a marriage to a Cavan girl, Blackley would also have been making connections in the area, which was important for a man newly arrived in the county and seeking to establish himself there. And in a letter to Farnham on the 4th of May, 1898, Blackley wrote that I am going to be married on the 2nd of June and would like to be away for a fortnight. And he wrote this at the end of a letter which dealt with other business on the estate. And he doesn't mention Ethel by name, for example, just as I'm getting married on the 2nd of June. And the main point of the information being shared seemed to be to assure Farnham that very little needed to be done while he was away on his honeymoon. So that's almost seems to be the only reason why he's talking about that. Almost immediately, Ethel became pregnant, and a baby boy also named Travers Robert, making 3 in a row, 3 generations with that name, grandfather, father, and son. Travers was born on the 10th of March, 1899. But tragedy struck, and Ethel died 2 days later at Drumbar as a result of childbirth. The boy survived, though Travers survived, and indeed he thrived. He later joined the British Army during World War I and later became a brigadier general in the British Army and died, I think, in around 1982 or something like that. Which was obviously must have been a terrible blow for Travers at that time. There was also another big loss in a few years' time because on the 22nd of November 1900, only 3 years after hiring Blackley, Somerset Henry Maxwell, 10th Lord Farnham, died in a Dublin hospital from esophageal cancer at the relatively young age of only 51. The sudden death of his eldest son and heir, Barry Maxwell, a few years previously, following a bicycle accident at Castle Sanderson, was a severe blow to Somerset, and one which I think he never really recovered from. It also meant that when Somerset died, that Blackley now had a new employer, Arthur Maxwell, who was Barry's younger brother, and he became the 11th Lord Farnham, and that's Arthur there. The transition seems to be a fairly smooth one, however, and Blackley continued working for the family in much the same way as he had under Somerset. At the time of the 1901 census, Travers, who was 35 at that point, and his son and namesake, who was 2 years old at this point, were living with 3 maids at Drumbar, I should say. Margaret Barron, who was aged 27, Bridget Heffernan, who was 38, and Maria Lee, who was 60, all of whom were Catholics. But on the 9th of July 1901, not long after the census was taken, Travers married again, this time to another Cavan girl, Lucy Ida Allen of Erskine Terrace in Cavan Town. The marriage took place in St. Anne's Church on Dawson Street, Dublin, and Travers' address was noted for the marriage as 22 St. Stephen's Green. Also noteworthy is that his occupation was listed as JP and not as a estate agent at this point. They were married by John Bishop Crozier, who was then the Bishop of Ferns, Loughlin, and Ossory, and he later became Archbishop of Armagh. And John Crozier, great name for a bishop, was himself born in Ballyhaise, County Cavan, so he had a Cavan connection there. Now, Lucy, his new wife, Lucy Ida Allen, was born in Dublin on the 6th of April, 1880, the daughter of Richard Allen, who was a prominent solicitor in Cavan, and Lucy Ann Allen. Now, Lucy Ann was a member of the Church of Ireland Halpin family in Cavan, another prominent family of solicitors. And indeed, the Allens and Halpins were in partnership together and had been for many years. At the time of Lucy's birth, the Allens were resident at 20 Upper Temple Street, Dublin. But the family eventually moved back to Cavan Town, where likely she met Travers there. They had a daughter, Honorine Una, likely named after Travers' mother, who was Honorine, and she was born on the 9th of November 1904, and she was baptized on the 18th of December that year. No other children seem to have been born to Travers and Lucy, leaving them with Travers Jr. From Travers' first marriage, and now Honorine, whom they called Una, to go by the second name. And incidentally, Lucy also goes by her second name. If she is speaking in kind of informal terms, she uses Ida rather than Lucy. But sometimes you'll see in formal documents, Lucy will be the name that's used rather than Ida. Now, Ida, as was expected from the wife of such a prominent man, involved herself in charitable fundraising and things like that. And she was a committee member of the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, attending meetings in Dublin in late 1910. She also seems to have had a busy time of it around that point, as she also performed the role of Mrs. Cholmondeley Jones in a charity performance along with her sister E. Allen of Snowed Up with a Duchess, which is a one-act comedy, for which there was a newspaper report of it, and Ida was reported as being talented and loudly applauded for her part in this. So these were the sort of things that wives were expected to do in the upper echelons, I suppose. Now, in 1911, Blackley household, when the census was taken that year, now comprised of 6 people. Travers, who was 44, Ida, who was 30, their daughter Honorine, who was age 6. There were 3 different maids, again, all Catholics, now employed by the family. Bridget Murphy, who was age 50, Kate Walsh, who was 23, and Mary Murray, who was 25. Travers Jr. was being educated in England at that time, and he was enrolled as a student at Charterhouse in Surrey, where Travers Sr. had gone as well. Now, Blackley was also Grand Treasurer of the Orange Lodge, and again would have taken a prominent role in the organisation of 12th marches and bonfires and things like that at the time. And he also was a signatory of the Ulster Covenant in 1912, and Ida also signed the Women's Declaration, and that's Ida's signature there in the middle. So her signature, Ida Blackley. So when she's writing herself, she calls herself Ida, but as I say, in formal things, she'll use Lucy. And that's her address there, obviously, Drumbar in Cavan. Now, Blackley was also appointed, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, as a JP and an undersheriff in Cavan. And that would also have been the cause of controversy. Even just by upholding the law, he would be putting himself in opposition to certain people if they didn't like what he was doing. Like in 1919, Blackley is sued in Ballyconn District Court in his position as sub-sheriff. And he sued for £31 that had been paid for the release of a car which had been seized following an accident in Kilshandra. And cases like that kind of set up an us and them sort of mentality, which aligned with his membership of the Orange Order is very public. role in the Orange Order, and it seems to be his antagonistic relationship with Farnham employees and tenantry. All of these things would have set him up in opposition to people along the way over the 25 plus years or 25 odd years really that he's working on the Farnham estate. All these things would have added up. Now, from the beginning of the War of Independence through the Civil War, a period of roughly 4 years beginning in 1919, numerous RIC barracks, army barracks, and big houses were singled out for attack from various Irish forces. Yet, although Farnham House itself was left untouched during the revolutionary period, Lord Farnham made the decision in the early 1920s to uproot the family from Farnham and move to England, where he found employment as a private secretary to a guy called Sir Glyn Hamilton West, who was chairman of a number of English steel and iron companies. Now, Farnham sold off some of the goods from the house before the family departed for England, although that was likely done as a means of raising much needed funds rather than fear of attack. Perhaps its position relatively close to Cavan town and the fact that it was still a working farm had some part to play in the house not being attacked. Possibly the opportunity for attack never fully presented itself, but for whatever reason, Farnham House remained unscathed and intact throughout this period. Others in Cavan, as we'll see now, were not so lucky. Maxwell property elsewhere in the county was attacked, although it was property belonging to a junior branch of the family. Fortland and Arley Cottage on the shores of Loch Sheelan, both of which were owned by a Captain Richard Maxwell, who was a cousin of Lord Farnham. They were attacked and looted by what was described as large numbers of men who descended like a swarm of locusts in 1924, stripping both properties bare. Nothing on these properties was safe during these raids. Trees were felled, gates and railings were removed, and more. And one eyewitness account stated that carts were going through the domains night and day, and great crowds of people at the houses. They were lifting whatever they could take with them. An ineffectual notice was placed in the Anglo South in August 1924, which stated that any persons found hunting or shooting on Arley and Fortland domain or trespassing in any way will be prosecuted after this date, the 23rd of August 1924. Clearly, looting and poaching on the estate was a real problem, which only stopped temporarily once the military came to Arley one day and fired shots at the looters. Captain Maxwell had left for England in 1920 and sought compensation of £40,000 for his losses. He had only received £3,114, as due to theft, Maxwell could not fully account for all of his property, and he had not sought protection from the civic guards for the property. This was the reason why he got such a small amount. He said, well, he should be getting much more, but they said, well, where's the proof that that you had these items that you're saying were stolen? But he couldn't show the proof because they'd been stolen. So it was a real catch-22 situation for poor Captain Maxwell. Now, Richard's woes had begun earlier than 1924, as the bailiff on his estate, a guy called Josiah Blackley, which is quite like Blackley, but a different guy, he was being sent threatening letters, supposedly from the IRA around 1923. And this is one of them here, which is in the Farnham archive in the Johnson Central Library. And this letter says, "Notice, sir, we are informed that you are taking great interest in Maxwell's land and the 11 months take. By order of IRA, you are requested not to take any part of Mr. Maxwell's land until the homeless men of Cavan is provided for. You are also requested to write to Mr. Maxwell and let him know that the men in Cavan, we go on to there, the men in Cavan is ready to meet him on the earliest possible date to arrange farms. Signed, IRA." And then it's addressed to Josiah Blackley, Foxfield. And a postscript added, "Hands off Maxwell land. I guess you have your dealing trick very well out of it." Now, Blackley also received visits from men claiming to represent the IRA, who threatened to empty the revolvers into him if he were responsible for Maxwell's compensation claim. These men were hoping that if the domain was destroyed, then the estate would be broken up and sold to them under the Land Purchase Acts, which we'll see later on. Now, Richard Maxwell continued to suffer financially as a result of the unrest in the county, and a letter dated the 4th of September 1924 from George William Fraser of Ballyjames Duff was sent to Maxwell's solicitor to inform his client that Fraser's brother and sister-in-law were pulling out of the purchase of Crover Cottage, part of the Fortland estate, following the burning of the Orange Lodge at nearby Ballymakew. These events had sufficiently worried the couple that they decided to withdraw their offer. So that was bad news for Maxwell. Now, what had made this branch of the Maxwell family so unpopular in the locality? From late 1922 and into early 1923, Richard Maxwell had issued a number of writs against tenants for non-payment of rent. And these writs were resisted by the tenants, who in 1922 had signed a petition requesting the abatement of rents as falling prices for farm produce had not been accompanied by a similar drop in rents. Maxwell's refusal to compromise on rent prices had made this absentee landlord a very unpopular man amongst his tenantry. Colonel Henry Maxwell, who'd been the previous owner of Fortland Estate, refused in 1917 to sell land under the Land Acts from the estate to Matthew McCabe, who was on the estate. He refused to sell to him on the grounds that McCabe was a member of Sinn Féin. McCabe complained about this, and he swore an affidavit in which he claimed that the reason for Maxwell's refusal to sell to him was not because he was a member of Sinn Féin, but because he was a Catholic. Perceived injustices like this likely played a part in the attacks on this particular estate in the early 1920s. Now, as has been demonstrated elsewhere, other attacks on big houses in Cavan had occurred during this period as well. In December 1920, Lanesborough Lodge at Quivy, Belturbet was raided, and in May the following year, the rectory and the lodge there were burned down. Blackley House outside Bomboy was burned, and its elderly occupant, the retired Church of Ireland cleric Dean John Finlay, was killed in June 1921. The White Venables home in Red Hills was burned that same month. There had been rumours that both it and Blackley House were going to be commandeered by British forces to use as military bases, which may explain why they were targeted. On the 28th of June 1921, the same day that the White Venables home was destroyed, the borough's residence in Stradone was also burned in what seemed to be coordinated attacks. Castle Saunderson, owned by the Saunderson family, who were cousins of the Farnhams, was taken over by auxiliaries in mid-1921. And by the spring of 1922, the family had left permanently, leaving the property open to wide-scale looting. When another Protestant landowner, Major General Oliver Nugent, returned to his home of Farnham House in Mount Nugent in 1920, he was unsure what reception he and his family could expect there. In a letter to one of his daughters, Nugent wrote, "I wonder what it would be like at home. I do not expect the people will be allowed to show any civility, and I think everything is likely to be very unpleasant, but I do not think they will shoot at us when we appear out of doors. I hope they won't. It would be such a nuisance to have to go out for a walk crawling on one's tummy." So at least Nugent had a sense of humour about this, at least. Now, Nugent, he needn't have worried too much, bar losing the car to raiders in 1921, and I think he may have had a hay barn burned as well. His main property was left untouched. But all of these examples demonstrate what has been termed the plight of Protestants in the border region at this time, where, as in Cavan, Leitrim, Monaghan, Longford, houses and orange halls were raided, Protestant businesses were boycotted, and Protestants were attacked and killed. Now, following the attack on Blackley in April 1922, he brought a claim in 1924 for £37,327 to the Cavan Quarter Sessions for the destruction of his property, of his furniture at Cavan Railway Station on Monday, the 20th of April 1922, and for his loss of income following his hasty departure from Ireland, as we're going to see. Blackley's affidavit was read out in court in 1924, and it stated that he had contacted the Irish Minister of Home Affairs, who informed Blackley that after the attack, and the Minister for Home Affairs informed Blackley that he'd been attacked by irregular troops, and apparently he gave the names of some of the men who had been wounded by Blackley and his son, and the minister stated that these guys were at that point convalescing in Cavan Infirmary, and we don't have their names, unfortunately. Now, following the shocking events of 8th of April 1922, which the judge at the Cavan Assizes in 1924 described as startling, Blackley, who was now aged 55, quickly realised that his time in Cavan was coming to a very abrupt end. The military authorities informed Blackley that it would be unsafe for him to remain in Cavan or indeed in Ireland. So on the following Monday, the Blackley family left for England. Even after his departure for England and further threats which necessitated a change of name for a while, Blackley claimed to have received 2 further letters threatening his life should he return to Ireland. Prior to the attack on his home, Blackley claimed to have received a number of letters which threatened his life should he attempt to execute decrees of the county court. So whatever was going on in his role as under-sheriff, he was obviously making himself unpopular at that time with certain groups of people. Now, the solicitor for the state in this claim, E.J. Duffy, dismissed Blackley's claims as propaganda and further demanded proof of the deaths of the 3 men. Duffy claimed that he had been told that 3 men had not been shot dead. There's no record of any deaths of men in Cavan from gunshot wounds around that time. If you look at the civil registrations, you can't find them, or in any death records, you can't find them. Nor are there any references to the attack on Drumbar House that I could find, at least at this point, in the military archives. And it is possible that Blackley exaggerated the deaths in order to prove his loyalty to the Crown and to help his claim to the Irish Grants Committee, which is something we'll be looking at in a moment. Duffy argued that Blackley's affidavit should not be accepted and requested that Blackley instead gives testimony in person, stating that to do so but stating that to do otherwise would be showing a lack of faith in the civic guards and the Free State Army. Now, notably, the judge rejected this argument and he accepted the affidavit in court, claiming, as I said, over £37,000 in compensation and loss of earnings in the civil court. Blackley instead received the derisory sum of £84 from the Irish Free State in 1924. Now, there was also another fund that he could apply to for compensation, and that was the Irish Grants Commission. And that had been established in London for those based in Southern Ireland who could demonstrate that any losses they had suffered between 1921 and 23 were due as a result of their loyalty to the British Crown. Now, Ida, Travers' wife, in her application to the Irish Grants Committee, reported that she and Travers had been in such a hurry to flee Cavan that she was forced to leave behind a substantial amount of valuables, which were later stolen from Drumbar House. Blackley still continued to represent Farnham even following his departure from Cavan, perhaps assuming or hoping that this was just a temporary move. And on the 31st of May 1922, Blackley was forwarded, for example, a list of town parks in Cavan town which belonged to Farnham with an eye to the possibility of selling them. Now, the solicitors Allen and Halpin, who, as we've seen, Blackley was married into, he had begun to represent, that is a company, had begun to represent the Farnham estate in 1915, and they became the estate agents in 1924. So Blackley had given up the ghost at this point. Even so, Blackley continued to keep up a correspondence with Farnham, not only to inquire whether he could receive some extra money from the estate for his 25-year service, but also to occasionally offer advice to his former employer. Now, whether this advice was welcome or not is unknown. And in April 1923, a year after he had left Cavan, Blackley asked Farnham whether, in light of the upcoming Land Purchase Act, would it not be well to get rid of what property you can in Ireland at a good price, rather than wait for this Land Purchase Bill, which would certainly be an iniquitous one. If I were you, I would get rid of every bit of land I could as soon as I could. Now, this act was following on from a similar one in the early 20th century, in 1903, which entailed the sale of estate land at advantageous prices for the tenant. And Blackley wrote to Farnham again in June, reminding his former employer that he expected a percentage of the proceeds of any sale of land which Farnham might make, writing that I think it would be unfair if his new solicitors, Allen and Halpin, should reap the whole benefit of the commission to which every agent looks forward to as compensation for the loss of his employment. So he was saying, well, they shouldn't be the guys who get the cut, Allen and Halpin, who, as I say, he was connected to. But he's saying they shouldn't get the cut because they've only been there a short time. I'm the person who should be getting the cut of any sales that are made. And in July 1923, Blackley again urged Farnham to sell up writing that I don't see how you're going to keep on Farnham. And after the election in Ireland, I do not think any owner in the south will be permitted to keep the lands that he has in his hands. Now, this is all very negative sort of stuff coming from Blackley. And it may be that the cash-strapped Blackley was hoping to get some kind of severance package, and that the cash raised by the sale of the estate will go in some way to Blackley in redundancy money. Now, Farnham's response to a later letter that Blackley wrote on this subject in September 1923 was not encouraging, and he informed Blackley that if I can manage to get anything out of it for you, I will see what can be done, as long as I have not got to find any money out of my pocket. So that didn't bode well. And Blackley wrote again to Farnham in January 1924, once he had heard of Jack Halpin's appointment as agent on the estate, again requesting a share of the fees involved. Farnham responded to say that he had not come to any agreement with Halpin about this, and it seems that Blackley was never discussed between Farnham and his new agent. And it doesn't appear, as far as can be gathered, that Blackley ever received any recompense from the sale of Farnham properties. But he did, however, receive a sum of money from the Irish Grants Commission, who, as I said a minute ago, he and his wife had applied to. Blackley, in his application to the IGC, stated that he had always been a unionist and held a prominent position in the Orange Order. And he said that these were the reasons that he was attacked, because the way you got your money from the IGC it was all about how loyal you were to the county. So when he made his application to the Irish state, he said, I was attacked because of my job as an undersheriff, which was he was employed by the Free State to do that job. But then when he applied for the IGC, there wasn't any word of the undersheriff job. Instead, he was attacked solely because of his loyalist or his unionist leanings and his membership of the Orange Lodge. So he was rewriting things slightly to shape his application in the hope of getting compensation. The Irish Free State, he says in this application, we're still paying him half his salary in his position as undersheriff after he had left. But after 15 months of that, he had been told that the state would only continue to pay him if he returned to work, and that it was now safe to do so. And Blackley said he did not believe this statement and did not believe that it was safe to return at this point. Now, Blackley also claimed 37,000 from the IGC, as he had also done from the Free State. So he was consistent in that. And again, the things that he said he wanted compensation for was the loss of income from his positions as estate agent and undersheriff, and as well as for the loss of the house. Even though he didn't own the house, Blackley estimated that was a loss of £100 a year to him, and the loss of his furniture, which was stolen at the railway station. But in all, Blackley was paid £6,500 from the IGC. He was given £1,000 in direct compensation up front, and he was given a loan of £5,000 to invest in an English company called Leckhampton Quarries, which would then employ him. And another £500 would be paid in installments over the following years. So all in all, £6,500. But £5,000 of that went into shares in this company that he would then work for. Now, and just as Blackley had joined the Orange Order, presumably at least in some way to forge links and alliances in Ulster when he moved to Ulster from Dublin. Now that he was living in Dublin, in London, he joined a gentleman's club, which is called the Junior Carlton Club, which is located at 30 Pall Mall in London. But Blackley's legal and financial woes continued, and in 1927, Peter Paul Galligan applied in the High Court to take a writ against Blackley over financial irregularities relating to elections which Galligan had contested. Galligan, who was a well-known Republican and former Sinn Féin TD for Cavan, had successfully contested the general elections held in December 1918 and May 1921. Now, Galligan retired from politics the following year, not putting himself forward for consideration in the June 1922 election. And by 1927, he was living in Henry Street, Dublin, and he was employed as a draper, which he had trained as a draper long before the revolutionary period. Now, for each of the elections he did contest, however, Galligan claimed that deposits of £150 each had been paid to Blackley in his position as returning officer. And Blackley, according to Galligan, had refused to refund these deposits following Galligan's successes at polls. The court granted leave to Galligan to serve Blackley with a writ. Now, no further reportage of this event takes place, and it seems likely that the cash-strapped Blackley managed to find the funds somewhere and repay Galligan. Excuse me. Even though he had left Cavan, Cavan continued to follow Blackley, often in unpleasant ways, and such incidents are an indication of the resentment which someone Cavan would have had towards Blackley. Now, on the 3rd of May 1927, Blackley's solicitor requested from the Irish Grants Committee a further advance of £100, which he said was badly needed. Now, if Galligan was looking for £300 of him, obviously Blackley needed any money wherever he could get it. And he says in his application to get the next instalment of his money, he says he lost his job with Leckhampton Quarries on the 23rd of December 1926 because the quarries had gone bust, and he was also obliged to give up his house that he was living in and move to a smaller one. Now, Blackley's lack of employment rankled with him because he felt, and this is what he wrote in the application, he felt that he had been a success with Leckhampton when they were able to give him work to do. Excuse me. And in November 1926, Blackley wrote to the IGC that I am in great trouble and anxiety and earnestly hope that I may be helped till things get going again. On the 28th of March 1928, Blackley was informed by the IGC that the £500 figure had been agreed on. He had been paid £375 of that, so there was £125 left, which was being paid over to him. So it took a year or more of him looking for this advance before he got it. Blackley had also written in February that year as a kind of reminder to sort of push on the IGC to get this money. And he said that Leckhampton quarries failed and were sold up. And the £5,000 which had been invested in the company on his behalf had now all been lost. And that £5,000 was actually technically a loan from the IGC, but it was written off. Now, Blackley continued to cast around, attempting to find work. And on the 7th of August 1928, he wrote to James Craig, who was the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, informing him that he would shortly be visiting the North from London, and he would be staying with a friend of his, Walter Richardson of Pembroke Lodge in Dunmurry, County Antrim. You probably knew him from his time on the Masserine estate in Antrim. And Blackley asked Craig to consider appointing him as a liaison officer between the two parliaments, and went on to inform Craig that I am living in London and want some work, however small. The Irish Grants Commission paid £5,000 into Leckhampton Quarries for me, and I was their London rep, but all the money went west and I am very hard up. Blackley had attempted to set up a meeting with Craig at Stormont, but was unable to do so, as when Blackley went there, Craig was actually away on business. Blackley's desperation for a meeting with Craig is evident in a series of letters between them. And he writes that he would shortly be going south to my mother, but if you intend to see me, I would, of course, go anywhere, and I hope for your help. So you can read the desperation of that. Unfortunately for Blackley, no help was forthcoming from Craig, in this instance at least. He received a reply from Craig on the 10th of August. It was sent to Walter Richardson in Dunmurry in Antrim, and it turned him down for this liaison officer. But Craig did express his sympathy for Blackley's position, noting that it must indeed be galling for you to be looking about for work after your long connection with the Farnham estate. And these kind words, well, they only went so far, and it was probably cold comfort for Blackley. But the friendly tone of Craig's letters obviously encouraged Blackley, who continued to keep open a line of communication with the Northern Ireland Prime Minister. And on the 26th of October 1928, Blackley wrote to Craig's secretary to check whether the Prime Minister had received what Blackley called a very important personal letter from him, worrying that he had not heard back, given Craig's usual prompt replies. And this was probably to do with Blackley's application for the post of secretary of Epsom Golf Club, which Craig had recommended Blackley for. Craig's secretary replied on the 30th of October, assuring Blackley that their letters had probably crossed each other in the post, and to expect it very shortly, had it not already landed by the time he received the secretary's letter. Now, that letter had obviously arrived, and although we don't know its contents, we can guess its tone, because on the 31st of October, Blackley wrote again to Craig, thanking him for your very kind letter, continuing to write that I hope I may get this appointment, but I am not banking on it. And Blackley ended his letter with the somewhat desperate request to Craig again, do let me see you when you're in this town. And we don't know whether they ever met again, or what employment Blackley managed to find himself after this. Travers Robert Blackley of 120 Ebury Street, London, and formerly of Drumbar, County Cavan, breathed his last on the 31st of January 1938 at the age of 71. The funeral was private, and the family requested that no flowers be sent. His estate was valued at £6,600, so he had obviously managed to right himself financially by the time of his death. And as the most prominent representative of the landlord system in Cavan, it's perhaps no surprise that Blackley was targeted for attack in Cavan in 1922. In fact, it's been suggested by Terry Dooley of Maynooth University that Blackley's actions while Farnham's land agent was the cause of much hostility towards him among the Farnham tenantry and employees, a resentment which came home to roost during Ireland's years of political and civil strife. And certainly you can see that in some of the examples I gave you earlier on. And his unpopularity may also relate to his activities as Under-Sheriff of Cavan in the years running up to and during the War of Independence. In the run-up to the attack on his home, as I mentioned earlier, Blackley claimed to have received a number of letters threatening his life if he attempted to execute decrees of the county court. And that seems to support that view. And certainly some of his actions on behalf of Farnham and his activities as a JP and Under-Sheriff would have set him in opposition against some people from Cavan before the War of Independence and eventually when the Civil War broke out as well. But the story of Travers Blackley tells us much about how quickly and how easily a settled and permanent life could be violently uprooted and a seemingly secure future swapped for something much less certain. The unsettled times certainly played its part, but so also, I believe, the previous unpopular actions of Travers Blackley, Farnham estate agent and Under-Sheriff for Cavan. I just want to finish up now as well by showing if anyone is interested in reading up on the Farnham estate of Blackley. In particular, this talk I've just given, it will be in a book edited by Professor Terence Dooley and Professor Christopher Ridgway, which is coming out later on this year, called The Country House and Its Visitors, Welcome and Unwelcome. There's also a book of photographs that I edited about 12 years ago now, called Farnham Images from the Maxwell Estate, and you can see some of the people that I've mentioned in today's lecture and some of the places as well. Jonathan Cherry, who's done a lot of work on the Farnhams, wrote a really nice introduction to the family, which was published in Breffni in the journal which I edit, which came out in 2006. There are also 3 stashes of manuscripts and letters where you can find Blackley letters and different things, which are really useful as well. And thankfully, with things opening up again, I was able to go around those and look at these places. One of them is Prony in Belfast. There's the letters between Blackley and Craig are in a file up there. That's the file number there. In the National Library on Kildare Street, there's a huge amount of Farnham papers there, and the manuscripts number there, 18617, and then folders 1 to 4 have a load of Blackley letters in there. As I say, he was writing to Farnham almost every day in the early days of his employment there. The Cavan Archive Service, which is based in the Johnson Central Library on Farnham Street, has a wonderful collection of Farnham material, and there's some Blackley stuff in there as well, which is really well worth having a look at. And then finally, the other place where you can get so much stuff is in the Anglo Celt as well, which gives so mumuch colour and detail. Is well worth having a look at as well. So just to finish off, I'd just like to thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed the talk. And as I say, there'll be much more coming later on in the year as well. But finally, I'd just like to thank Cavan County Council for supporting this, and in particular the library service for all their help, and especially within that the county librarian Emma Clancy, Jonathan Smith, and Sinead McCardle of the library service there for all of their help. And as I say, thank you to you all as well for watching.